what are the commonalities, differences between major world religions. And for better or worse, they can basically be divided amongst the major world religions into two broad groups, classifications, Eastern and Western. It has actually little to do with geography, more so to do with, well, we'll look at the points here in a second. Now, here in terms of Western religions, what do we mean? Here, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. We can include Zoroastrianism in there, the Baha'i faith. No, Sikhism is not on the list there. Sikhism could go with either one. It has threads from both Western and Eastern. Eastern religions include Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Taoism, and Shintoism. Those would be generally classified under the Eastern religions category. Now, here, if we get into, okay, well, what are the differences? How are they different? So what makes a Western religion Western, Eastern, and so on? Now, here, Western religions have a number of basic commonalities. The first one is that they're all linear. Now, what does linear mean? It means there's a beginning to creation, time and space, and there will be an end, a day of judgment, a day of the resurrection, day of reckoning, and so forth. So an end to history as we currently know it. Okay, so they're all linear. Second of all, they are monotheistic. Now, Zoroastrianism, we'll mention this a little bit later, is an exception. There's two gods, but in general, monotheistic. And so monotheism here, as the term implies, there is one God to the exclusion of all others. So there's one God to the exclusion of all others. So that means there are no other gods. There's only one. There's another term we could introduce here, henotheism, coming from the Greek word one. Henotheism, technically Zoroastrian would veer towards henotheism, but it's probably better than dualism. But henotheism is a belief, loyalty to one God, but not to the exclusion of others. So in other words, there could be other gods out there, but one gives one's allegiance, heart, loyalty, devotion to one God. Okay, that would be henotheism. But generally, okay, so Western religions fall under the major category of there is one God, creator, and so on. Third, here, Western religions believe in divine intervention, revelation. What does this mean? Well, God has created not just time and space, but is active in it. So God doesn't just, like the deism, where God sits with the universe and lets it go. In the Western religions, God is active in creation. In other words, God reveals himself to humanity. Now, obviously, different Western religions will differ on the nature of that revelation, but they will all agree on the fact that God reveals himself. Now, fourthly is the integrity of personal identity, separation of the creator from creation. Now, what do we mean here? What does that mean? Integrity of personal identity. What's up with that? Well, here it might be something taken for granted if one is part of Western culture, but here is the belief that you are you and you remain you even in the afterlife. So you retain your personal identity. So there's an integrity to who you are. So for better or for worse, you're you. And not just in this life, but in the afterlife as well. So you don't become someone else, but retain your personal identity, integrity there. And this is related to, might seem like a different notion, but it's actually closely related to this understanding that God is separate from creation. So God is transcendent, above and beyond time and space, but creates matter. So in other words, God may be active, relating to point number 3, in time and space, so divine intervention, revelation, and so on, answering prayers, miracles, those are all examples of divine intervention. But God is separate from creation, so God is transcendent. All right, and that point might become a little clearer when we get into Eastern religions. Now, Eastern religions are cyclical. Now, what does that mean? Unlike Western religions, they're not linear, so there is no beginning, there is no end. There are different cycles, okay, which can last millions and millions of years, but they go back, they will go forward, and they continue on. So it's cyclical in nature. There's no beginning, there is no end. There can be an end to a certain age, era, and so forth, but the universe is past eternal, and future eternal as well. Now here, related to this, is a second point on samsara and moksha. Now within different Eastern religions, these can take on different terms and so forth, but what do we mean, or what does samsara mean? Well, samsara refers to the wheel of life. So just as creation is cyclical, well, so too is one's existence is part of this ongoing a wheel of life. And within the wheel of life, you'll find different creatures and so on. Humans, hey, right on, happen to be higher up on the scale. And okay, great thing. Higher up than, some of the lower life forms, plants, and mosquitoes or whatever. But all part of this cycle of samsara, the life, the wheel of life of life, birth, life, death, and rebirth. So you have life, death, rebirth in this wheel of life. Now, what's the point of this? Well, within samsara is to achieve moksha. Moksha means liberation and obliteration. So liberation and obliteration. Okay, what's that? Well, a liberation from the wheel of life. One no longer is part of the wheel of life. So once one lives and experiences death, then and achieves moksha, one is not reborn, reincarnated, put back into the wheel of life. One actually achieves liberation, and this involves obliteration. So and this actually goes into the fourth point there. And personal identity is not retained, so one becomes absorbed into the absolute Brahman. It'll be different terms, but it's kind of like a drop of water within the ocean. That drop becomes absorbed and dissipates into the absolute. So here there's this disintegration ultimately of one's identity. Now here there's related to this notion of personal identity, here within birth, rebirth, life, death, rebirth, one's personal identity is very fluid. In fact, creation, the material world, is seen as illusory. So it's an illusion, really. And in fact, that you actually retain a personal identity is also part of an illusion. You're not actually you. The sooner you realize this, the quicker you will achieve enlightenment and be able to see, the proper perspective, where you fit in the wheel of life and so on. Same thing if you're reborn as Pablo the cockroach in South America somewhere. Well, here your previous life would have had some sort of influence on Pablo the cockroach in the future life, but Pablo is still something separate. So it's as if your life is like a rock or something dropped within a stream which flows. You have a ripple effect on what comes later, but that ripple will have an influence on the next life in the rebirth. But that rebirth also is something new as well. So long story short, personal identity is not retained. Now, this is the third point on the list, but is that Eastern religions, very interesting, span the spectrum of theism, of different beliefs in terms of God. So they can be theistic. So, for instance, Hinduism would be theistic. Certain branches of Buddhism would be theistic, whereas other faiths would be deistic. So Jainism, for instance, would be deistic. They believe there's 24 Ford makers who created the universe. They've set it up, and to be a Jain is to be a winner, which means to achieve moksha, basically. But within this life, the forward makers cannot help you. So there's this constant diet of prayer, fasting, and it's all very aesthetic. Life, a very difficult. Not many Jains around. It broke away from Buddhism, from Hinduism around the same time as Buddhism, around 600 BC. But in any case, Jainism, the idea here is that through all this prayer, fasting, all this spiritual work, one builds oneself up to try and achieve this moksha, but it's not through divine intervention. So there's no prayer, grace, and so forth, which the individual receives. It's all your own efforts which bring you up to attempt to achieve this moksha. So prayer, fasting, all that stuff is really devoted to lifting oneself up to achieve this moksha. And then some can actually be classified as atheistic as well. So for instance, certain branches of Buddhism would actually deny there is a God. And again, there would be meditation, but certainly obviously not a prayer in petitioning, asking for intercession and so forth. Very distinct from other branches of Buddhism, which would be certainly theistic, where actually praying devotion to Buddha and so forth.